Hey, what's up? Hold on, I forgot to start my recording. How's everybody doing out there, internet land? What's up? What's up? What's up? Yo, can I hear myself? Can I hear myself? Do do do. Do 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 do. Yo yo yo. I wonder why I can't hear myself more. Oh well. It'll have to do. It'll have to do. It'll have to do. Oh, oh, where'd I leave my lighter? All right. Well, I'm having to redo these chapters. I'm having to redo these chapters because my motherfucking mic was making a bunch of scratchies. So, if you want the pure, if you want the pure, unvarnished first Jeff take, watch those earlier ones and just deal with the scratching because I did not remember the crazy stuff that happened in these chapters. Um, so I might not be quite as freaked out this time. Uh, but so I'm just going to take advantage of that, and maybe I won't feel quite as freaked out this time. I gotta get my shit all situated. All right. Chapter 15. Quoting. Usually I'm pretty mild. In fact, many of my friends are kind enough to call it folksy when I'm writing or speechifying. My ambition is to live by the side of the road and be a friend to man. But I hope that none of the gentlemen who have honored me with their enmity think for one single moment that when I run into a gross enough public evil or a persistent enough detractor, I can't get up on my hind legs and make a sound like a two-tailed grizzly in April. So, right at the start of this account of my 10-year fight with them, as private citizen, state senator, and U.S. senator, let me say that the Sang Fray River Light Power and Fuel Corporation are, and I invite a suit for libel, the meanest, lowest, cowardliest gang of yellow livered, backslapping, hypocritical gun toters, bomb throwers, ballot stealers, ledger fakers, givers of bribes, suborners of perjury, scab hirers, and general low-down crooks, liars, and swindlers that ever tried to do an honest servant of the people out of an election. Not but what I have always succeeded in licking them, so that my indignation at these homicidal kleptomaniacs is not personal, but entirely on behalf of the general public. 0 hour, Berzelius Windrip. I was going to say what I remember of what I said that first time. Man, he's really given it to this random company from wherever he lives in Cleveland or whatever. Hilarious. It's totally Mein Kampfy, man. And there's a little bit of Kaczynski in there. On Wednesday, January 6th, 1937, just a fortnight before his inauguration, President-elect Windrip announced his appointments of cabinet members and of diplomats. Secretary of State. His former secretary and press agent, Lee Saracen, who also took the position of High Marshal or Commander-in-Chief of the Minutemen, which organization was to be established permanently as an innocent marching club. Secretary of the Treasury, one Webster R. Skittle, President of the prosperous Fur and Hide National Bank of St. Louis. Mr. Skittle had once been indicted on a charge of defrauding the government on his income tax, but he had been acquitted, more or less, and during the campaign he was said to have taken a convincing way of showing his faith in these goddamn sentences. He was said to have taken a convincing way of showing his faith in Buzz Windrip as the savior of the forgotten men. Curse you, LaCroix. Making me burp. I'm going coconut. I got coconut this time because I don't like it very much, so it makes me drink it more slowly. I've always been like a slam it guy, but with like barely flavored water, it's kind of pointless. So I thought maybe if I do coconut, I'll be like, okay, I'm slightly hydrated. You know. If you want to relive all this amazing sound in hi-fi podcast energy, listen to Everything is Awesome podcast. And I'm on there. I'm doing shit. I'm talking to people. I'm moderating conversations. Reading chapters of my book. And in this case, reading Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. If you want to take part, send me an email. everythingisawesomepodcast@gmail.com, or find me on Twitter @EIA Podcast, or me, Jefe, @El Jefe Tacoma. That's where you'll find me. Let's move on. Secretary of War, Colonel Osceola Luthorn, formerly editor of the Topeka, Kansas Argus and the Fancy Goods and Novelties Gazette, more recently high in real estate. His title came from his position on the honorary staff of the governor of Tennessee. He had long been a friend and fellow campaigner of Windrip. It was a universal regret that Bishop Paul Peter Prang should have refused the appointment as Secretary of War, with a letter in which he called Windrip, quote, "my dear friend and collaborator," and asserted that he had actually meant it when he had said he desired no office. Later, it was a similar regret when Father Coughlin refused the ambassadorship to Mexico, with no letter at all, but only a telegram cryptically stating, quote, "just 6 months too late." A new cabinet position, that of Secretary of Education and Public Relations, was created. Not for months would Congress investigate the legality of such a creation, but meantime, the new post was brilliantly held by Hector McGoblin, MD, PhD, honorary lit D. Senator Porkwood graced the position of Attorney General, and all the other offices were acceptably filled by men who, though they had roundly supported Windrip's almost socialistic projects for the distribution of excessive fortunes, were yet known to be thoroughly sensible men and no fanatics. It was said, though Doremus Jessup could never prove it, that Windrip learned from Lee Saracen the Spanish custom of getting rid of embarrassing friends and enemies by appointing them to posts abroad, preferably quite far abroad. Anyway, as ambassador to Brazil, Windrip appointed Herbert Hoover, who not very enthusiastically accepted. As ambassador to Germany, Senator Bora. As governor of the Philippines, Senator Robert La Follette, who refused. And as ambassadors to the court of St. James, France, and Russia, none other than Upton Sinclair, Milo Reno, and Senator Bilbo of Mississippi. These three had a fine time. Mr. Sinclair pleased the British by taking so friendly an interest in their politics that he openly campaigned for the Independent Labor Party and issued a lively brochure called, quote, "I, Upton Sinclair, prove that Prime Minister Walter Elliot, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, and First Lord of the Admiralty Nancy Astor are all liars and have refused to accept my freely offered advice." Mr. Sinclair also aroused considerable interest in British domestic circles by advocating an act of Parliament forbidding the wearing of evening clothes and all hunting of foxes except with shotguns. And on the occasion of his official And on the occasion of his official reception at Buckingham Palace, he warmly invited King George and Queen Mary to come and live in California. Mr. Milo Reno, insurance salesman and former president of the National Farm Holiday Association, whom all the French royalists compared to his great predecessor, Benjamin Franklin, for forthrightness, became the greatest social favorite in the international circles of Paris, the Basses Pyrenees, and the Riviera, and was once photographed playing tennis at Antibes with the Duc de Troppé, Lord Rothermere, and Dr. Rudolf Hess. Senator Bilbo had possibly the best time of all. Stalin asked his advice, as based on his ripe experience in the Gleichschaltung of Mississippi, about the cultural organization of the somewhat backward natives of Tajikistan. And so valuable did it prove that Excellency Bilbo was invited to review the Moscow military celebration the following November 7th, in the same stand with the very highest class of representatives of the classless state. It was a triumph for His Excellency. Generalissimo Voroshilov fainted after 200,000 Soviet troops, 7,000 tanks, and 9,000 aeroplanes had passed by. Stalin had to be carried home after reviewing 317,000. But Ambassador Bilbo was there in the stand when the very last of the 626,000 soldiers had gone by, all of them saluting him under the quite erroneous impression that he was the Chinese ambassador. And he was still tirelessly returning their salutes, 14 to the minute, and softly singing with them the Internationale. He was less of a hit He was less of a hit later, however, when, to the unsmiling Anglo American Association of Exiles to Soviet Russia from Imperialism, he sang to the tune of the Internationale what he regarded as amusing private words of his own. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, from Russia make your getaway. They are they all are rich in Bilbo's nation. God bless the USA. Mrs. Adelaide Tarr Gimmich, after her spirited campaign for Mr. Windrip, was publicly angry that she was offered no position higher than a post in the customs office in Nome, Alaska, though this was offered to her very urgently indeed. She had demanded that there be created, especially for her, the cabinet position of Secretarius of Domestic Science, Child Welfare, and Anti-Vice. She threatened to turn Jeffersonian, Republican, or communistic. But in April, she was heard of in Hollywood, writing the scenario for a giant picture to be called They Did It in Greece. As an insult and boy from home joke, the president elect appointed Franklin D. Roosevelt minister to Liberia. Mr. Roosevelt's opponents laughed very much, and opposition newspapers did cartoons of him sitting unhappily in a grass hut with a sign on which NRA had been crossed out and USA substituted. But Mr. Roosevelt declined with so amiable a smile that the joke seemed rather to have slipped. 30s comedy. What are you going to do? It probably killed back then. But now I don't have a clue. I don't know if it's funny or not. And neither do you. Ba-da-bow. Neither do you. Ba-ba. All right. Enough of that foolishness. The followers of President Windrip trumpeted that it was significant that he should be the first president inaugurated not on March 4th, but on January 20th, according to the provision of the new 20th Amendment to the Constitution. It was a sign straight from heaven, though actually heaven had not been the author of the amendment, but Senator George W. Norris of Nebraska, and proved that Windrip was starting a new paradise on earth. The inauguration was turbulent. President Roosevelt declined to be present. He politely suggested that he was about half ill unto death, but that same noon he was seen in a New York shop, buying books on gardening and looking abnormally cheerful. More than 1,000 reporters, photographers, and radio men covered the inauguration. 27 constituents of Senator Porkwood of all sexes had to sleep on the floor of the senator's office, and a hall bedroom in the suburb of Bladensburg rented for $30 for 2 nights. The presidents of Brazil, the Argentine, and Chile flew to the inauguration in a Pan American aeroplane, and Japan sent 700 students on a special train from Seattle. A motor company in Detroit had presented to Windrip a limousine with armor plate, bulletproof glass, a hidden nickel steel safe for papers, a concealed private bar, and upholstery made from the Toison tapestries of 1670. But Buzz chose to drive from his home to the Capitol in his old Hupmobile sedan, and his driver was a youngster from his hometown whose notion of a uniform for state occasions was a blue serge suit, red tie, and derby hat. Windrip himself did wear a topper, but he saw to it that Lee Saracen saw to it that the 130 million plain citizens learned by radio, even while the inaugural parade was going on, that he had borrowed the topper for this one sole occasion from a New York Republican representative who had ancestors. But following Windrip was an un-Jacksonian escort of soldiers, the American Legion, and, immensely grander than the others, the Minutemen, wearing trench helmets of polished silver and led by Colonel Dewey Hake in scarlet tunic and yellow riding breeches and helmet with golden plumes. Solemnly, for once looking a little odd, a little like a small town boy on Broadway, Windrip took the oath, administered by the Chief Justice, who disliked him very much indeed, and, edging even closer to the microphone, squawked, "My fellow citizens, as the President of the United States of America, I want to inform you that the real New Deal has started right this minute, and we're all going to enjoy the manifold liberties to which our history entitles us, and have a whale of a good time doing it. I thank you." That was his first act as president. His second was to take up residence in the White House, where he sat down in the East Room in his stocking feet and shouted at Lee Saracen, "This is what I've been planning to do now for 6 years. I bet this is what Lincoln used to do. Now let him assassinate me." His third, in his role as commander-in-chief of the army, was to order that the Minutemen be recognized as an unpaid but official auxiliary of the regular army, subject only to their own officers, to Buzz, and to High Marshal Saracen, and that rifles, bayonets, automatic pistols, and machine guns be instantly issued to them by government arsenals. That was at 4 p.m. Since 3 p.m., all over the country, bands of MMs had been sitting gloating over pistols and guns, twitching with desire to seize them. Fourth coup was a special message next morning to Congress. In session since January 4th, the third having been a Sunday, demanding the demanding the instant passage of a bill embodying point 15 of his election platform, that he should have complete control of legislation and execution, and the Supreme Court be rendered incapable of blocking anything that it might amuse him to do. By joint resolution, with less than half an hour of debate, both houses of Congress rejected that demand before 3 p.m. on January 21st. Before 6, the president had proclaimed that a state of martial law existed during the, quote, present crisis, and more than 100 congressmen had been arrested by Minutemen on direct orders from the president. The congressmen who were hot-headed enough to resist were cynically charged with inciting to riot. They who went quietly were not charged at all. It was blandly... Oh, man, this stuff is a little less shocking the second time you hear it. But y'all might be hearing this for the first time. It was blandly explained to the agitated press by Lee Saracen that these latter quiet lads had been so threatened by, quote, irresponsible and seditious elements that they were merely being safeguarded. Saracen did not use the phrase protective arrest, which might have suggested things. To the veteran reporters, it was strange to see the titular Secretary of State, theoretically a person of such dignity and consequence that he could deal with the representatives of foreign powers, acting as press agent and yes man for even the president. There were riots instantly all over Washington, all over America. The recalcitrant congressman had been penned in the district jail. Toward it, in the winter evening, marched a mob that was noisily mutinous toward the Windrip for whom so many of them had voted. Among the mob buzzed hundreds of Negroes, armed with knives and old pistols, for one of the kidnapped congressmen was a Negro from Georgia, the first colored Georgian to hold high office since carpetbagger days. Surrounding the jail, behind machine guns, the rebels found a few regulars, many police, and a horde of Minutemen. But at these last they jeered, calling them Minnie Mouses and Tin Soldiers and Mama's Boys. The MMs looked nervously at their officers and at the regulars who were making so professional a pretense of not being scared. The mob heaved bottles and dead fish. Half a dozen policemen with guns and nightsticks trying to push back the van of the mob were buried under a human surf and came up grotesquely battered and ununiformed. Those who ever did come up again. There were 2 shots, and 1 Minuteman slumped to the jail steps. Another stood ludicrously holding a wrist that spurted blood. The Minutemen, why, they said to themselves, they'd never meant to be soldiers anyway, just wanted to have some fun marching. They began to sneak into the edges of the mob, hiding their uniform caps. That instant, from a powerful loudspeaker in a lower window of the jail, brayed the voice of President Berzelius Windrip. I am addressing my own boys, the Minutemen, everywhere in America. To you and you only, I look for help to make America a proud, rich land again. You have been scorned. They thought you were the lower classes. They wouldn't give you jobs. They told you to sneak off like bums and get relief. They ordered you into lousy CCC camps. They said you were no good because you were poor. I tell you that you are, ever since yesterday noon, the highest lords of the land, the aristocracy, the makers of the new America of freedom and justice. Boys, I need you. Help me. Help me to help you. Stand fast. Anybody tries to block you, give the swine the point of your bayonet. A machine gunner MM, who had listened reverently, let loose. The mob began to drop and into the backs of the wounded as they went staggering away. The MM infantry running poked their bayonets. Such a juicy squash it made, and the fugitives looked so amazed, so funny, as they tumbled in grotesque heaps. The MMs hadn't, in dreary hours of bayonet drill, known this would be such sport. They'd have more of it now. And hadn't the President of the United States himself told each of them personally that he needed their aid? Shit. Man. When the remnants of Congress ventured to the Capitol, they found it seeded with MMs, while a regiment of regulars under Major General Meineke paraded the grounds. The Speaker of the House and the Honorable Mr. Perley Beecroft, Vice President of the United States and presiding officer of the Senate, had the power to declare that quorums were present. If a lot of members chose to dally in the district jail, enjoying themselves instead of attending Congress, whose fault was that? Both houses passed a resolution declaring point 15 temporarily in effect during the crisis. The legality of the passage was doubtful, but just who was to contest it, even though the members of the Supreme Court had not been placed under protective arrest, merely confined each to his own house by a squad of Minutemen. Bishop Paul Peter Prang had, his friends said afterward, been dismayed by Windrip's stroke of state. Surely, he complained, Mr. Windrip hadn't quite remembered to include Christian amity in the program he had taken from the League of Forgotten Men. Though Mr. Prang had contentedly given up broadcasting ever since the victory of justice and fraternity in the person of Berzelius Windrip, he wanted to caution the public again. But when he telephoned to his familiar station, WLFM in Chicago, the manager informed him that, just temporarily, all access to the air was forbidden, except as it was especially licensed by the offices of Lee Saracen. Oh, that was only one of 16 jobs that Lee and his 600 new assistants had taken on in the past week. Rather timorously, Bishop Prang motored from his home in Persepolis, Indiana, to the Indianapolis airport and took a night plane for Washington to reprove, perhaps even playfully to spank, his naughty disciple, Buzz. He had little trouble in being admitted to see the president. In fact, he was, the press feverishly reported, at the White House for 6 hours, though whether he was with the president all that time they could not discover. At 3 in the afternoon, Prang was seen to leave by a private entrance to the executive offices and take a taxi. They noted that he was pale and staggering. In front of his hotel, he was elbowed by a mob who, in curiously unmenacing and mechanical tones, yelped, "Lynch 'em! Down the enemy's Windrip!" A dozen MMs pierced the crowd and surrounded the bishop. The ensign commanding them bellowed to the crowd so that all might hear, "You cowards, leave the bishop alone! Bishop, come with us, and we'll see you're safe." Millions heard on their radios that evening the official announcement that, to ward off mysterious plotters, probably Bolsheviks, Bishop Prang had been safely shielded in the district jail. And with it, a personal statement from President Windrip that he was filled with joy at having been able to, quote, "rescue from the foul agitators my friend and mentor, Bishop P.F." Sorry, my eyes. Bishop P. Prang, than whom there is no man living who I so admire and respect. There was as yet no absolute censorship of the press, only a confused imprisonment of journalists who offended the government or local officers of the MMs. And the papers chronically opposed to Windrip carried by no means flattering hints that Bishop Prang had rebuked the president and been plain jailed, with no nonsense about a rescue. These mutters reached Persepolis. Night of the Long Knives. This is when they start weeding out their competitors. The very people they use to get here, they're killing them off or sidelining them. Dark, man. Dark shit. Not all the Persepolitans ached with love for the bishop or considered him a modern St. Francis gathering up the little fowls of the fields in his handsome LaSalle car. There were neighbors who hinted that he was a window peeping snooper after bootleggers and obliging grass widows. But proud of him, their best advertisement, they certainly were. And the Persepolis Chamber of Commerce had caused to be erected at the eastern gateway to Main Street the sign, "Home of Bishop Prang, radio's greatest star." So, as one man, Persepolis telegraphed to Washington, demanding Prang's release. But a messenger in the executive offices, who was a Persepolis boy, he was, it is true, a colored man, but suddenly he became a favorite son, lovingly remembered by old schoolmates, tipped off the mayor that the telegrams were among the hundredweight of messages that were among the hundredweight of messages that were daily hauled away from the White House unanswered. Then a quarter of the citizenry of Persepolis mounted a special train to march on Washington. It was one of those small incidents which the opposition press could use as a bomb under Windrip, and the train was accompanied by a score of high-ranking reporters from Chicago and later from Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and New York. While the train was on its way, and it was curious what delays and sidetrackings it encountered. A company of mil- a company of Minutemen at Logansport, Indiana, rebelled against having to arrest a group of Catholic nuns who were accused of having taught treasonably. High Marshal Saracen felt that there must be a lesson, early and impressive. A battalion of MMs sent from Chicago in fast trucks arrested the mutinous company and shot every third man. When the Persepolitans reached Washington, they were tearfully informed by a brigadier of MMs who met them at the Union Station that poor Bishop Prang had been so shocked by the treason of his fellow Indianans that he had gone melancholy mad, and they had tragically been compelled to shut him up in St. Elizabeth's government insane asylum. No one willing to care news no one willing to carry news about him ever saw Bishop Prang again. The brigadier brought greetings to the Persepolitans from the president himself, and an invitation to stay at the Willard at government expense. Only a dozen accepted. The rest took the first train back, not amiably. And from then on, there was one town in America in which no MM ever dared to appear in his ducky forage cap and dark blue tunic. The chief of staff of the regular army had been deposed. In his place was Major General Emmanuel Kuhn. Doremus and his like were disappointed by General Kuhn's acceptance, for they had always been informed, even by the nation, that Emmanuel Kuhn, though a professional army officer who did enjoy a fight, preferred that that fight be on the side of the Lord, that he was generous, literate, just, and a man of honor. And honor was the one quality that Buzz Windrip wasn't even expected to understand. Rumor said that Kuhn, as Nordic a Kentuckian as ever existed, a descendant of men who had fought beside Kit Carson and Commodore Perry, was particularly impatient with the puerility of anti Semitism, and that nothing so pleased him as, when he heard new acquaintances being superior about the Jews, to snarl, "Did you by any chance happen to notice that my name is Emmanuel Kuhn, and that Kuhn might be a corruption of some name rather familiar on the east side of New York?" "Oh, well, I suppose even General Kuhn feels orders are orders," sighed Doremus. I gotta put something in my eyes. I'll be right back. Yo, hit the like button. Shoot me a tweet at EIA Podcast or at El Jefe Tacoma. Read my book. It's called Day One. It's the first book in the trilogy. It's real good. I'm getting the art made for it. You can read an advance copy if you like. Hit me up. Everything is awesome podcast at gmail.com. Let's see if this is any better. How's our recording doing? Okay. Orders are orders. President Windrip's first extended proclamation to the country was a pretty piece of literature and of tenderness. He explained that powerful and secret enemies of American principles, one rather gathered that they were a combination of Wall Street and Soviet Russia, upon discovering to their fury that he, Berzelius, was going to be president, had planned their last charge. Everything would be tranquil in a few months, but meantime there was a crisis during which the country must, quote, bear with him. He recalled the military dictatorship of Lincoln and Stanton during the Civil War, when civilian suspects were arrested without warrant. He hinted how delightful everything was going to be. Right away now, just a moment, just a moment's patience, when he had things in hand. And he wound up with a comparison of the crisis to the urgency of a fireman rescuing a pretty girl from a conflagration and carrying her down a ladder for her own sake, whether she liked it or not, and no matter how appealingly she might kick her pretty ankles. The whole country laughed. "Great card, that Buzz, but mighty competent guy," said the electorate. "I should worry whether Bish Prang or any other nut is in the booby hatch, long as I get my $5,000 a year, like Winder promised," said Shad Ledoux to Charlie Betts, the furniture man. It had all happened within the 8 days following Windrip's inauguration. Whoosh, slashing your opponents. You're either with me or against me. It's the friggin' mob, yo. That's Trump shit. It's the mob. It's the mob. They're everywhere. Russian mob, Italian mob, like they're all getting a taste. Can you believe the level of security clearance this guy has? And he has all these entanglements. Crazy. It's all bad. The whole thing. Chapter 16. Quoting, "I have no desire to be president. I would much rather do my humble best as a supporter of Bishop Prang, Ted Bilbo, Gene Talmadge, or any other broad-gauged but peppy liberal. My only longing is to serve." 0 hour, Berzelius Windrip. Like many bachelors given to vigorous hunting and riding, Buck Titus was a fastidious housekeeper, and his mid-Victorian farmhouse fussily neat. It was also pleasantly bare, the living room a monastic hall of heavy oak chairs, tables free of dainty covers, numerous and rather solemn books of history and exploration, with the conventional sets, and a tremendous fireplace of rough stone. And the ashtrays were solid pottery and pewter, able to cope with a whole evening of cigarette smoking. The whiskey stood honestly on the oak buffet, with siphons and with cracked ice always ready in a thermos jug. It would, however, have been too much to expect Buck Titus not to have red and black imitation English hunting prints. This hermitage, always grateful to Doremus, was sanctuary now. He adequately damn Windrip and Co. and people like Francis Tasbro, who in February was still saying, "Yes, things do look kind of hectic down there in Washington, but that's just because there's so many of these bull-headed politicians that still think they can buck Windrip. Besides, anyway, things like that could never happen here in New." More and more qualifiers. That's how this thing develops. Have you noticed that? Everything has a weirder and weirder qualifier until there's no freedom for anyone. And they just slip them in there. This is like even before everything about Hitler was known. He's getting quite a lot of it. I don't know how much of it was in the Enabling Act that basically neutered the Reichstag. Uh, Man, I need to know more about that because my belief is that it was a false flag operation. They set fire to the Reichstag and blamed it on a communist. But don't quote me on that. That's just what I heard. But either way, it was as if they had the Enabling Act already drawn up, and they just used the fire as a pretext. But I'm not sure. Maybe it was something like in this book where they'd campaigned with it for a while, but I don't remember that. Any whoozle be. Things like that could never happen here in New England. And indeed, as Doremus went on his lawful occasions past the red brick Georgian houses, the slender spires of old white churches facing the green, as he heard the lazy irony of familiar greetings from his acquaintances, men as enduring as their Vermont hills, it seemed to him that the madness in the capital was as alien and distant and unimportant as an earthquake in Tibet. Constantly, in The Informer, he criticized the government, but not too acidly. The hysteria can't last. Be patient and wait and see, he counseled his readers. It was not that he was afraid of the authorities. He simply did not believe that this comic tyranny could endure. It can't happen here, said even Doremus, even now. The one thing that most perplexed him was that there could be a dictator seemingly so different from the fervent Hitlers and gesticulating fascists and the Caesars with laurels round bald domes, a dictator with something of the earthy American sense of humor of a Mark Twain, a George Ade, a Will Rogers, an Artemus Ward. Windrip could be ever so funny about solemn, jaw drooping opponents and about the best method of training what he called, quote, a Siamese flea hound. Did that, puzzled Doremus, make him less or more dangerous? Then he remembered the most cruel, mad of all pirates, Sir Henry Morgan, who had thought it ever so funny to sew a victim up in wet rawhide and watch it shrink in the sun. Is that a real thing? That's some Edie Amin shit. That is, whoo, boy, howdy. That's Catherine the Great. Was that the one who had the rap as a blood bather? Whatever. Dark. Very dark. It's like the Joker level of comedy. From the perseverance with which they bickered, you could tell that Buck Titus and Lorindo were much fonder of each other than they would admit. Being a person who read little and therefore took what he did read seriously, Buck was distressed by the normally studious Lorinda's vacation liking for novels about distressed princesses. And when she airily insisted that they were better guides to conduct than Anthony Trollope or Thomas Hardy, Buck roared at her and, in the feebleness of bated strength, nervously filled pipes and knocked them out against the stone mantel. But he approved of the relationship between Doremus and Lorinda, which only he and Chad Ledoux had guessed, and over Doremus, 10 years his senior, this shaggy headed woodsman fussed like a thwarted spinster. To both Doremus and Lorinda, Buck's overgrown shack became their refuge. And they needed it late in February, 5 weeks or thereabouts after Windrip's election. I know you won't leave me, but I refuse to let you go. Beg and plead for your sympathy. I don't mind, 'cause you mean that much to me. Ain't too proud, babe. Back to the reading. Despite strikes and riots all over the country, bloodily put down by the Minutemen, Windrip's power in Washington was maintained. The most liberal four members of the Supreme Court resigned and were replaced by surprisingly unknown lawyers who called President Windrip by his first name. A number of congressmen were still being protected in the District of Columbia jail. Others had seen the blinding light forever shed by the goddess reason and happily returned to the capital. The Minutemen were increasingly loyal. They were still unpaid volunteers, but provided with expense accounts considerably larger than the pay of the regular troops. Never in American history had the adherents of a president been so well satisfied. They were not only appointed to whatever political jobs there were, but to ever so many that really were not. And with such annoyances as congressional investigations hushed, the the official awarders of contracts were on the merriest of terms with all contractors. One veteran lobbyist for steel corporations complained that there was no more sport in his hunting. You were not only allowed, but expected to shoot all government purchasing agents sitting. None of the changes was so publicized as the presidential mandate abruptly ending the separate existence of the different states and dividing the whole country into 8 provinces. Thus, asserted Windrip, economizing by reducing the number of governors and all other state officers, and asserting Windrip's enemies, better enabling him to consummate and hold the country. The new Northeastern province included all of New York State north of a line through Ossining and all of New England except a strip of Connecticut shore as far east as New Haven. This was, Doremus admitted, a natural and homogeneous division, and even more natural seemed the urban and industrial metropolitan province, which included Greater New York, Westchester County up to Ossining, Long Island, the strip of Connecticut depending on New York City, New Jersey, northern Delaware, and Pennsylvania as far as Reading and Pennsylvania as far as Reading and Scranton. Each province was divided into numbered districts, each district into lettered counties. each county into townships and cities, and only in these last did the old names, with their traditional appeal, remain to endanger President Windrip by memories of honorable local history. And it was gossiped that next the government would change even the town names, that they were already thinking fondly of calling New York Brazilian and San Francisco San Saracen. Probably that gossip was false. The northeastern province's 6 districts were: 1. Upper New York State west of and including Syracuse; 2. New York east of it; 3. Vermont and New Hampshire; 4. Maine; 5. Massachusetts; 6. Rhode Island and the unraped portion of Connecticut. District 3, Doremus Jessup's district, was divided into the 4 counties of southern and northern Vermont and southern and northern New Hampshire, with Hanover for capital. The district commissioner merely chased the Dartmouth students out and took over the college buildings for his offices, to the considerable approval of Amherst, Williams, and Yale. So Doremus was living now in Northeastern Province, District 3, County B, Township of Beulah, and over him, for his admiration and rejoicing, were a provincial commissioner, a district commissioner, a county commissioner, an assistant county commissioner in charge of Beulah Township, and all their appertaining guards and emergency military judges. Citizens who had lived in any one state for more than 10 years seemed to resent more hotly the loss of that state's identity than they did the castration of the Congress and Supreme Court of the United States. Indeed, they resented it almost as much as the fact that, while late January, February, and most of March went by, they still were not receiving their governmental gifts of $5,000, or perhaps it would beautifully be $10,000 apiece, had indeed received nothing more than cheery bulletins from Washington to the effect that the Capital Levy Board, or CLB, was holding sessions. Virginians whose grandfathers had fought beside Lee shouted that they'd be damned if they'd give up the hallowed state name and form just one arbitrary section of an administrative unit containing 11 southern states. San Franciscans who had considered Los Angelinos even worse than denizens of Miami now wailed with agony when California was sundered and the northern portion lumped in with Oregon, Nevada, and others as the Mountain and Pacific Province, while Southern California was, without her permission, assigned to the Southwestern Province, along with Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Hawaii. As some hint of Buzz Windrip's vision for the future, it was interesting to read that this southwestern province was also to be permitted to claim, quote, all portions of Mexico which the United States may from time to time find it necessary to take over, as a protection against the notorious treachery of Mexico and the Jewish plots there hatched. Lee Saracen is even more generous than Hitler and Alfred Rosenberg in protecting the future of other countries, sighed Doremus. As provincial commissioner of the Northeastern Province, comprising Upper New York State and New England, was appointed Colonel Dewey Hake, that soldier, lawyer, politician, aviator, who was the chilliest blooded and most arrogant of all the satellites of Windrip, yet had so captivated miners and fishermen during the campaign. He was a strong flying eagle who liked his meat bloody. As district commissioner of District 3, Vermont and New Hampshire, appeared to Doremus's mingled derision and fury none other than John Sullivan Reek, that stuffiest of stuffed shirts, that most gaseous gas bag, that most amenable machine politician of northern New England, a Republican ex-governor who had, in the alembic of Winthrop's patriotism, rosily turned leaguer. No one had ever troubled to be obsequious to the Honorable J.S. Reek, even when he had been governor. The weediest backcountry representative had called him Johnny. In the gubernatorial mansion, 12 rooms and a leaky roof. And the youngest reporter had bawled, "Well, what bull you handing out today, X?" It was this Commissioner Reek who summoned all the editors in his district to meet him at his new vice-regal lodge in Dartmouth Library and receive the precious privileged information as to how much President Winthrop and his subordinate commissioners admired the gentleman of the press. Before he left for the press conference in Hanover, Doremus received from Sissy a poem, at least she called it that, which Buck Titus, Lorinda Pike, Julian Falk, and she had painfully composed late at night in Buck's fortified manor house. Be meek with reek, go fake with hake. One rhymes with sneak, and t'other with snake. Hake with his beak is on the make, but Sullivan Reek, oh God! Well, anyway, Winthrop's put everybody to work, and he's driven all these unsightly billboards off the highways. Much better for the tourist trade, said all the old editors, even those who wondered if the president wasn't perhaps the least bit arbitrary. As he drove to Hanover, Doremus saw hundreds of huge billboards by the road, but they bore only Winthrop propaganda, and underneath, with the compliments of a loyal firm and very large Montgomery cigarettes or Jonquil foot soap. On the short walk from a parking space to the former Dartmouth campus, several men muttered to him, "Give us a nickel for cup of coffee, boss. A Minnie Mouse has got my job, and the mouses won't take me. They say I'm too old." But that may have been propaganda from Moscow. On the long porch of the Hanover Inn, officers of the Minutemen were reclining in deck chairs, their spurred boots. In all the organization, there was no cavalry. Up on the railing. Doremus passed a science building in front of which was a pile of broken laboratory glassware, and in one stripped laboratory he could see a small squad of MMs drilling. District Commissioner John Sullivan Reek affectionately received the editors in a classroom. Old men, used to being revered as prophets, sitting anxiously in trifling chairs, facing a fat man in the uniform of an commander who smoked an unmilitary cigar as his pulpy hand waved greeting. Reek took not more than an hour to relate what would have taken the most intelligent man 5 or 6 hours. That is, 5 minutes of speech and the rest of the 5 hours to recover from the nausea caused by having to utter such shameless rot. President Winthrop, Secretary of State Saracen, Provincial Commissioner Hake, and himself, John Sullivan Reek, they were all being misrepresented by the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, the Communists, England, the Nazis, and probably the jute and herring industries. And what the government wanted was for any reporter to call on any member of this administration, and especially on Commissioner Reek at any time, except perhaps between 3 and 7 a.m., and, quote, get the real lowdown. Excellency Rake announced then, and now, gentlemen, I am giving myself the privilege of introducing you to all four of the county commissioners who were just chosen yesterday. Probably each of you will know personally the commissioner from your own county, but I want you to intimately and cooperatively know all four, because, whomever they may be, they join with me in my unquenchable admiration of the press. The four county commissioners, as one by one they shambled into the room and were introduced, seemed to Doremus an oddish lot. A moth-eaten lawyer known more for his quotations from Shakespeare and Robert W. Service than for his shrewdness before a jury. He was luminously bald except for a prickle of faded, rusty hair, but you felt that, if he had his rights, he would have the floating locks of a tragedian of 1890. A battling clergyman famed for raiding roadhouses, a rather shy workman, an authentic proletarian who seemed surprised to find himself there. He was replaced a month later by a popular osteopath with an interest in politics and vegetarianism. The fourth dignitary to come in and affectionately bow to the editors, a bulky man, formidable looking in his uniform as a battalion leader of Minutemen, introduced as the commissioner from northern Vermont, Doremus Jessup's county, was Mr. Oscar Ledoux, formerly known as Shad. Damn. That motherfucker sucks. Mr. Reek called him Captain Ledoux. Doremus remembered that Shad's only military service prior to Windrop's election had been as an AEF private who had never got beyond a training camp in America and whose fiercest experience in battle had been licking a corporal when in liquor. Mr. Jessup, bubbled the Honorable Mr. Reek, I imagine you must have met Captain Ledoux. Comes from your charming city. Uh, 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 said Doremus. Sure, said Captain Ledoux. I've met old Jessup, all right. All right. He don't know what it's all about. He don't know the first thing about the economics of our social revolution. He's a chauvinist, but he isn't such a bad old coot, and I'll let him ride as long as he behaves himself. Splendid, said the Honorable Mr. Reek. Well, that's two chapters. My heart rate is a lot lower this time. That's not as scary to me because I've been through it once already. Again, you're experiencing this for the first time. Maybe you're having some feelings. Talk about them with your friends and family. Share your thoughts with me. Tweet us at EIA Podcast. Listen to my other shows, Shattered Worlds RPG, Good Idea, Something Wonderful Right Away. Check out our other sinister parent company line of products, Brothers in Time, and the other one, straight off the top of my headlines. Got more shows coming, cooler people joining. It's really fun and smart and thoughtful, good products over there. Check it out. And also my actual play set in the world of Stephen King's Dark Tower, The War for the Tower. Find that at warforthetower.com. That's probably enough. I'm done wildly gesticulating. I hope the audio isn't all fucked up this time, because that sucked to have to do this a third time. Anywho, you guys are great. Stand up and fight. Defend your friends and family and your neighbors and people you don't know but who are in danger. We're all in this together. Peace.